Hello, everybody. Greetings. It's Jesse here, and we're going to continue with our reading on The Papacy is the Antichrist, a Demonstration by J.A. Wiley. And we are going to be reading in chapter 7 today. And this chapter is titled The Pastor Becomes a Monarch, 10 Centuries of Climbing. And just as we discussed in previous chapters, and that this self-proclaimed King of Kings and Lord of Lords really started out as a small seed and eventually grew. And even at a small seed, it was still proclaimed to be declared the head over all the churches, thus starting a 1260-year reign of, terror and torture and murder and diabolic sects and diabolic social or societies, commonly known as the Jesuits or the Knights Templars, which, by the way, for example, the Templars you can actually find in one of the levels of Masonry. So that just gives you a clue of who is behind the workings of Freemasonry. Because you have Roman Catholic connections just in the names of the levels of Masonry alone that will tell you that the Masonic order is Jesuit controlled or Jesuit backed. So, but I'm not going to get into a whole subject on Masonry, but I just wanted to make that little bit of a note so that you can kind of have a little bit of understanding on that. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and continue our reading here, and we're going to start in chapter 7. Again, the title is called The Pastor Becomes a Monarch, and a monarch is essentially what would be coined today as a dictator, dictatorship and these types of things. 10 centuries of climbing. Beginning his career in the days of Paul, it was not till the 13th century that the man of sin reached his maturity and stood before the world full grown. During all these ages, he kept stretching himself higher and higher, piling assumption upon assumption and prerogative upon prerogative. It's just like taking the steps of the ladder, or a newborn. You have a newborn baby. He starts off not being able to roll over or not able to hold his head up. Then he can start holding his head up. He can start rolling over. He can start crawling. Then from crawling, he can start walking. And then getting into things, and you have to say no all over the time, all the time, and no this, no that. I'm sure you parents and mothers and fathers know how that is. Well, essentially, it's the same concept as this. He started out real small, but he ended up growing. The papacy ended up growing and growing and growing until really the full manifestation of the man of sin reached its maturity, as what J.A. Wiley would state around the 13th century. But I have to emphasize that didn't mark the beginning of his temporal authority. Okay, his temporal authority began in the 6th century through the decrees of Justinian and things of that nature. So, beginning his career in the days of Paul, it was not till the 13th century that the man of sin reached his maturity and stood before the world full grown. During all these ages, he kept stretching himself higher and higher, piling assumption upon assumption and prerogative upon prerogative, till at last he raised himself to a height from which he looked down not only upon all churches, but upon all kings and kingdoms. He claimed to the world's one bishop and world's one monarch. He claimed to be the world's one bishop and world's one monarch, priest and king. Okay, much like that's how when you look at King Nebuchadnezzar, you can see traits from Babylon and the papacy. Nebuchadnezzar was himself. He was a priest and he was a king. He had religious and temporal rule. In the 1st century, he is seen as the humble pastor whose only care is to feed his flock, and who looks for no crown save that which the chief shepherd may be pleased to give him at his appearing. In the 13th century, he is beheld as a mighty potentate who stands with his foot planted on every throne and realm of Christendom. He writes himself a quote-unquote king of kings, and he claims by divine right to administer all the affairs of earth. If we accept Christianity, there is no similar example in history of what was at first so small, becoming in the end so great. 300 popes or more and more are seen one after the other, steadily prosecuting this idea, without once relaxing in their efforts or turning aside from the pursuit. Each in succession takes up the plan at the point where his predecessor had left it, and carries it a stage nearer its consummation. For 1,300 years on end, we see the enterprise pushed forward with an undeviating constancy. So this growth is a constant growth, okay? Much like, you look at the aspect of the presidency of the United States. You had George Bush. He enabled things like the Patriot Act that would allow a declension or a deletion of freedoms and these types of things. And Barack Obama comes in. He didn't write those things off, but he continued it, and he's continuing it. And then the president after him is going to continue with what he left off. You see, there is no doing away of previous laws. And sometimes they may do that, but you can go and look all throughout the executive orders and stuff like that, and all those executive orders are still valid, even the ones that Bush made when he was in office, just as much as Obama's orders are when he was in office. And the next guy is going to come along and just follow suit from where he left off, regardless if he's a Democrat or a Republican. It's just going to be a different variation of politics. That's all it is. It's the same concept as here, because at one stage you had a very conservative, radical conservative viewpoint of the popes with their inquisitions and these types of things. Well, that was during a period of time, and that period of time ended. And so when that period of time ended, it was time for the shift to go to a more liberal stance, acting the part as being a leader for the people, talking about human rights and these types of things, while still clinging to the doctrines of canon law. And then eventually, that pendulum is going to swing back. And then when that pendulum swings back, you can expect full-blown persecution. It's going to be wide open. Now it's not so wide open. You have a play on words, so to speak, like aspects like the common good and these types of things, which means the common good for all. So when you hear the Pope talk about the common good, what really that is that's basically like a socialistic type of system where, you don't have a right to private property to the point where all things are common. For example, if somebody were to come off the street and say, I need this on your so-called private property, that's not private property. Well, in the guise of the New World Order, which was the same as the Old World Order, they can go and take it. And you have to be willing to give it to them. Or else, or else. And that's going to be the laws of the land. And so hence, therefore, neglecting the commandment of thou shalt not steal. Okay. "300 popes and more are seen one after the other, steadily prosecuting this idea without once relaxing in their efforts or turning aside from the pursuit. Each in succession takes up the plan at the point where his predecessor had left it, and carries it a stage nearer its consummation. For 1,300 years on end, we see the enterprise push forward with an undeviating constancy and an unflinching courage, with a perseverance and subtlety. In short, a combination of powers never before seen working together for the realization of any other project. There is more than man here. There is more than man here. The spirit who conceived this plan, who inspired the actors and kept them working century after century on the same lines till at last a goal was reached, was more than human. Paul tells us that its author was Satan. A great apostasy was to precede the rise of the Antichrist. Okay, again, another thing about Satan is you got to remember that he is the dragon that gave the beast its power and great authority. And so Satan works through the man of sin. So when you hear, like in Revelation, where the whole world is deceived and these types of things, and you hear about the man of sin be revealed, and then that wicked, which that wicked is attributed to Satan, well, that's Satan working in that man of sin, the papacy, the popes. Okay, so really, in a sense, and he deceives the whole world. So when you look at the papacy, that's the dragon himself. Not Jesus Christ hidden under a veil of flesh, but Satan hidden under a veil of flesh. Okay, because Satan is not omniscient. He's not omnipresent. He can't be at like 3 places at once like the Holy Spirit can. Okay? But he has to have his minions. He has to have his agents all over. Hence, this is why you got like the Jesuit order. This is why you got the military might of the United States. This is why you got like the Council of Foreign Relations, the NSA spying and all the little trinkets and gadgets of phones and cameras all over the place. He is trying to counterfeit God. He's trying to mimic God because he wants to be like the Most High. And so what you're seeing is a war that started out in heaven is taking place right here on earth. That is why when Paul states we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, rulers of this world, and these types of things. Okay, this is a spiritual war. This war is a mindset war, basically. Okay, and this war is to culminate in the aspect that its mission, the war's mission, is to get those that are in Christ to follow Antichrist. And hence that's why you have these doctrines that come up and people carried out by every wind of doctrine, and for example, like the 70th week of Daniel, the gap theory, that after the 69th week, the 70th week is not going to be fulfilled till the future, and it's Antichrist that's going to fulfill that, and these types of things. So this battle is a spiritual war. It's a spiritual war. And it's a war that started in heaven, and it continues to this very day. A great apostasy was to precede the rise of the Antichrist. In truth, the man of sin was to grow out of that apostasy. Be not troubled or alarmed, says the apostle, writing to the Thessalonians, as if time were to be wound up and Christ were to return. It's Thessalonians 2 and 3. That day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed. Not a falling away, but the falling away. Okay? The falling away, as it is in the original Greek. Some great and notable apostasy. The church must pass through a dark and terrible shadow before Christ shall return. The prophets had spoken not obscurely of that evil time. It was the burden of Daniel's prophecy. It was repeated in the symbolic picturings of John. Paul, in his other writings, had referred to it, portraying with brief but vivid touches the essential characteristics of the power which at that era was to cast his dark shadow on the world. Hardly had the early persecution ceased till that falling away set in. Jerome lifts the veil in the 4th century and disclosed a truly melancholy picture. In vain we look for the humility, the simplicity, and the purity of the early church. The gold refined in the furnace of 10 persecutions is waxing dim. The vine which Paul planted at Rome is being transformed into the vine of Sodom. The pastors of the church are becoming inflamed with the love of riches, and are striving with one another for preeminence. Rome daily sees her bishop ride forth in a gilded chariot drawn by prancing steeds. Her clergy shows themselves attired in robes of silk. The members of their flock crowd alternately the church and the theater, and rush with indecent haste from superstitious rites performed at the tombs of the martyrs to the games and sports of the circus. The apostasy has fairly set in. Okay, this is also at a time when, persecution had pretty much ceased. Christianity, of course, as through Constantine's eyes, were to take place in political affairs and these types of things, and they adapted all sorts of rites and ceremonies and rituals that previously pagans were practicing. It just, basically, it put over itself a garment of Christianity. And so the members of their flock crowd alternately the church and the theater, and rush with indecent haste from superstitious rites performed at the tombs of the martyrs to the games and sports of the circus. The apostasy has fairly set in. The corruption grows with the current of the centuries. It shapes itself into system. It builds error upon error and buttresses itself all around the assumptions and falsehoods. The organization in which it enshrines itself necessarily and naturally finds for itself a chief or head. Now comes the Pope and his hierarchy. The man of sin has appeared. Okay, so here Wiley basically gives you a a brief chronology of the 4th century, a very, very brief chronology, in which, it's very well documented, is that, you had this apostasy that started, and it just grew and grew and grew and grew, and then out of the ashes of that apostasy, finally arose and positioned himself as the man of sin. The bishop of bishops, the king of kings, the lord of lords. Not only now was he considered to be the head of the church, but now he had temporal rulership as well. And he had jurisdiction over the church in which he could pronounce judgments regarding crimes and these types of things, and how they would be treated if they were deemed a heretic. That's what Justinian's decree was all about, that he is to be the corrector of heretics, the head of all churches. And that decree first went out in 533, and it was enacted in 538, thus beginning the 1260 years. He is seen to rise out of the earth of a paganized Christianity. Okay, and who was responsible for that paganized Christianity? Well, it was Constantine the Great. Okay, like the soil from which he is sprung. Okay, so obviously this house was built on sand. All right, not on the rock, on sand. He is pagan in essence, though Christian in appearance. Several notable events helped him to attain his full stature. We must indicate a few, not all of these, for it is impossible to write the history of the 13th centuries in our short chapter. The first event which contributed essentially to the development of the papacy was the removal of the emperor from Rome. Had Caesar continued to reside in his old capital, he would, as the phrase is, have sat upon the pope. And this aspiring ecclesiastic could not have shot up into the powerful potentate which prophecy had foretold. But Constantine in A.D. 334 removed to the New Rome on the Bosphorus, leaving the old capital of the world to the Bishop of Rome, who was henceforth the first and most influential personage in that city. Sorry about that. It was then probably that the idea of founding an ecclesiastical monarchy suggested itself to him. Priest-king. A religio-political entity. He had fallen heir by what must have seemed a lucky accident. To the old capital of the world, he was, moreover, possessor of the chair of Peter, or believed himself to be so, and out of these two, the old town of the Caesars and the old chair of the apostle, it might even be possible so, doubtless, he reasoned to fabricate an empire that would one day rival and even overtop that of the emperors. Okay. So Constantine moves his capital over to Constantinople, and started what could be known as the Eastern Empire, and so therefore the Western Empire was basically left, no one to govern. And so the Bishop of Rome basically took upon himself, this seat, but it wasn't publicly recognized at this time, okay? That's the key thing. So you can't really say, well, how come it wasn't 334 that the 1260 years went out? Well, because there wasn't a decree that went forth. Okay, Constantine left the Western Roman Empire and established his capital in Constantinople. All right, that's just basically that's what happened, and so therefore the Western Empire was left deserted, with no king, but the Bishop of Rome. He had fallen heir by what must have seemed a lucky accident to the old capital of the world. He was, moreover, possessor of the chair of Peter, or believed himself to be so. Okay, believed himself to be so. I mean, again, Peter was never really technically in Rome, and as I stated before, this successor or possessor of the chair of Peter, you really should aptly apply this to possessor of the chair of Simon Magus. Okay, because that's literally the first pope, and you can read about indulgences in the book of Acts. He's the first guy that basically established the indulgences. All right, so moreover, possessor of the chair of Peter, or believed himself to be so, and out of these two, the old town of the Caesars and the old chair of the apostle, it might even be possible so, doubtless he reasoned, to fabricate an empire that would one day rival and even overtop that of the emperors. These, it might have been thought beforehand, were but slender materials to bear the weight of so great an enterprise, yet with their help, and aided, doubtless, by deeper than mere human counsel, he projected a sovereignty which has not had its like on earth, which survived the fall of the Roman Empire, which lived through all the convulsions and overturnings of the Middle Ages, and which has come down to our day, and has the art, when men believe it to be about to expire, of rallying its powers and coming back upon the world. And at the time J.A. Wiley published this, basically, what he's saying is, this is basically a period of time where, the Pope supposedly, or as it seemed to be, appeared to be wounded to death, and stripped of its temporal power, basically became, and you can look this up, the phrase, the prisoner of the Vatican. I mean, the papacy never stepped foot outside the Vatican walls for a certain period of time. The papal states were, basically done away with, and these types of things. And he was just the head of the churches. But at the same time, when you really, really look deep into it, he was still writing the laws of the land for the whole world. Okay? The old world and the new world. That's funny because we hear, like myself and others that say the New World Order is simply the Old World Order revived, okay? And, well, what is Europe considered? Europe is considered the Old World. What is the West considered? The United States and these types of things is considered the New World. And Columbus, who was a Catholic in and of himself, Roman Catholic, went to set foot on his travels to discover a new world. Okay? So they were already in the workings of adopting this new world. I mean, I don't know if they... So that really kind of tells me, it's like, did they have this planned a few hundred years prior that this was going to happen to the Pope? That he was going to lose his temporal power? That's a question for topic, but nevertheless, it's kind of interesting that throughout history you have Europe, which is called the Old World, and then you have the United States and everything in between that decided to be called the New World. All right, so what does that tell you? Well, when you look at the beast out of the earth, which is the United States, okay, and they are to, and they create an image to the beast, and they go out throughout the world and causeth all to wander after this beast, to worship this beast, this first beast. Well, obviously, they're going to adapt laws and regulations that coincide with Roman Catholic canon law, worded a little bit differently, but it's the same thing. And hence, this is to happen in the New World. So the first beast, through the second beast, is going to establish this new world, which is simply the social order of the old world. Okay. So about this time, moreover, the equality which had reigned among the pastors of the church in the primitive age was broken. The bishops claimed superiority above the presbyters, nor was there equality even among the bishops themselves. They took precedence not according to their learning or their talents or their piety, but according to the rank of the city in which their see was placed. Finally, a new and loftier order arose, overtopping the episcopate. Christendom was partitioned into 5 great patriarchates: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. These were the 5 great cities of the empire, and their bishops were constituted the 5 great princes of the church. Now came the momentous question, for a while so keenly agitated, which of the 5 shall be the first? Constantinople claimed this honor for her patriarch on the ground that it was the residence of the emperor. Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem each put in its claim, but to no effect. Constantinople found, however, a powerful rival in the old city on the banks of the Tiber. Rome had been the head of the world, the throne of the Caesars. Around it was still the halo of 1,000 victories, and that gave it a mysterious influence over the imaginations of men, who began to see in its bishop the first ecclesiastic of the Christian world. The popular suffrage had pronounced in favor of the Roman bishop before his rank had received imperial ratification. He was installed as the first of the 5 patriarchs in A.D. 606. The Emperor Phocas, displeased with the Bishop of Constantinople, who had condemned the murder of Maurice, by which Phocas opened his way to the imperial dignity, made Boniface III universal bishop. The imperial edict, however, gave to the Roman bishop only the precedence among the 5 patriarchs. It gave him no power or jurisdiction over them. Mere rank the bishops of Rome held to be but an empty honor. What they coveted was substantial power. Their policy was now shaped with the view of reducing the whole clergy of the church into obedience to the Roman share and exalting the popes to supreme and absolute sovereignty. Centuries passed away, in the course of which, by the help of many an artifice, and under cover of many pretexts, the Roman bishops slowly extended their power over the West. The darkness which accompanied the descent of the Gothic nations favored their project in high degree. Bad wares, says Pufendorf in his introduction to the history of Europe, are best vended in the dark or at least in a dim light. End quote. Some of the quote-unquote wares vended in these quote-unquote dark times were sufficiently remarkable. Out of many we give but two examples. The Emperor Constantine, by his last will and testament, was made to bequeath to Sylvester, Bishop of Rome, the whole Western Empire, including palace, regalia, and all the belongings of the master of the world, a goodly dowry, verily, for the poor fisherman. Then came another windfall to the papacy, in the shape of the decretals of Isidore. This last showed the church, to her equal surprise and delight, that her popes from Peter downwards had held the same state, lived in the same magnificence, and promulgated their pontifical will in briefs, edicts, and bulls, in the same authoritative and lordly style as the grand popes of the Middle Ages. Both documents, it is unnecessary to say, were sheer forgeries. They are acknowledged by Romanists to be so. So these documents, the treaties of Constantine and these types of things, these documents that Romanists, they admit that they're forged documents. They could not have stood a moment's scrutiny in an enlightened age, but they were accepted as genuine in the darkness of the times that gave them birth, and vast conclusions were founded upon them. The fabrications of Isidore were made the substructions of canon law. Okay, so regardless of, because you'll hear, oh my goodness, you'll hear people that are researching this and will present this information to you, and then you have people come up and say, oh, well, those are forged documents. Those weren't even real. Well, it doesn't really matter if they're real or not, because Rome acknowledged them to be forged documents, but at the same time, they still based their canon laws on those forged documents. The fabrications of Isidore were made the substructions of canon law, and that stupendous fabric of legislation is still maintained to be of divine authority, even today. Despite that it is now acknowledged to be founded on a forgery, the northern nations arrived in southern Europe in the 5th and succeeding centuries. Ignorant of Christianity, this was another cause that favored the advancement of the man of sin. These nations, on their arrival in Italy, beheld a great spiritual potentate seated in the chair of Caesar. He told them that he was the successor of Peter, and Peter the Apostle, and I'll just put in there Simon Magus, whom Christ had constituted his vicar on earth, with power to transmit all his prerogatives, spiritual and temporal, to his successors in his office. This was the only gospel the Pope ever preached to the barbarian tribes. They had no means of testing the legitimacy of these mighty claims. In the Pope himself, they recognized no very distant resemblance to their own archdruid. The rites of the Roman temples were not unlike the worship they had practiced in their pagan homes. They had easy access to the baptismal fount, their pagan beliefs and manners forming no impediment. Nation after nation entered the Roman Pale, the Franks leading the way and earning for themselves the title of the eldest son of the Church. The Gothic nations had found in the Pope, before whose chair they now bowed down, a common spiritual father. Thus was accomplished another notable stage in the development of the papacy. His dignity enhanced by his vast accession of new subjects, the Pope set himself to strengthen his power within the Church, that is, the Roman Catholic Church, by completing the subjection and vassalage of the clergy. He let slip no opportunity that offered to compass this end. Since the 5th century, the bishops who lived on this side of the Alps used to go to Rome to visit the sepulchres of the apostles Peter and Paul. This journey was a voluntary one, being undertaken to gratify the devout or superstitious feeling of the pious excursionist. In no long time it was made obligatory, and those who failed to present themselves at the apostolic threshold were subjected to rebuke as lukewarm in their devotion to the holy chair. It was next interpreted in the sense that the itinerant bishops had sought confirmation at Rome, and that all bishops ought to go thither for that end. Thus there came another accession of prerogative and dignity to the papal chair. Further, it was a usual practice of churches and bishops to ask the advice of the Roman Church in matters of consequence and difficulty, or crave the right interpretation of particular canons. When they at Rome perceived that their advice was taken as a decision, they began to send their decrees before they were demanded, and pretense that Rome, being the first see of the Christian world, her bishop ought to take care that the canons and ecclesiastical laws were duly kept. Hence another encroachment upon the liberties of churches and pastors, and another accession to papal dignity and jurisdiction. And further, when differences or quarrels arose betwixt bishop and bishop, or betwixt church and church, nothing was more natural than for the parties at variance to solicit the mediation of the Bishop of Rome. The Pope willingly undertook the task of composing their contentions, but the price he exacted was a still further surrender of the liberties of the Church. He thence took occasion to assume the office of a judge, and to represent his chair as a tribunal to which he had a right to summon parties. At times he came in betwixt a metropolitan and his diocesan, and on one pretext or other deposed the latter, to the awakening of the jurisdiction of the former. Moreover, it sometimes happened that parties who had been condemned before provincial tribunals were encouraged to appeal to Rome, where the cause was reheard and the provincial sentenced. It might be revoked. By these stealthy and persistent steps, the Pope contrived to keep on the ascending grade. He's growing and growing and growing. There followed other most ingenious devices, all for the same end. Among these was the pall of consecration. The pall was sent to all bishops from the Pope, at first as a gift. It was next represented as indispensable, and that without it no bishops could discharge the functions of his office. Thus a new hold was obtained over the clergy. So you can see the developments of the clergy has no say on any matters, for all matters and all decisions come through the Pope, and only the Pope, and that's it. So thus a new hold was obtained over the clergy, and a new method inventing of replenishing the papal coffers for a high price was put on this mystic article of dress, which was woven of the wool of the lambs of St. Agnes. To the same end were annals imposed. This was the sum paid by bishops when they changed from one see to another, a practice allowed by the Pope for the gain it brought him. The multiplication of monks and friars tended to the same end. The Pope summoned into existence the corps of the regular clergy to play them off against the army of the seculars. He acted on the maxim, divide and conquer, quote unquote. Now that's very interesting. So he acted on the maxim, divide and conquer. Question: what was the Civil War all about here in America? It was division, right? Divide and conquer, right? You had the North pitted against the West. And the whole issue that you'll read in your history books was about slavery. But what you don't realize is, out of the ashes of the Civil War, were to add a couple more amendments that would really technically enslave us all. So who was really behind the formation of the Civil War? It was the Jesuits and the Papacy. He acted on the maxim, divide and conquer. The monks were a check upon the bishops. They watched their proceedings and carried the report to Rome. They had acquired a vast reputation for holiness, and the direction of consciences through the confessional was mainly in their hands. They had discovered the secret of amassing riches by the arts of mendicancy. They swarmed over Europe and were thoroughly devoted to the interests of the papal see. And if any bishop set himself in opposition to the Pope, they raised such a clamor against him as speedily convinced him that that they had no alternative but submission. You dare not raise a hand against the papacy. Especially did the English monk Winfrid, who changed his name to Boniface, enlarge the papal dominion. This man is commonly but erroneously credited with the first Christianization of Germany. Okay, this man is commonly but erroneously credited with the first Christianization of Germany. All right. Invested with the authority of the Pope's legate, he traversed the countries on the east of the Rhine, rooting out the schools and churches of the evangelical faith, which had been numerously planted in that region of Europe, by the Chaldean missionaries of the Irish and Scottish nations, substituting in their room Roman monasteries and cathedrals. All right. Now, again, this is where the whole aspect that Catholicism is Christianity and Christianity is Catholicism really started to take root. Okay? Because obviously this is what was going on. They were overthrowing evangelical faiths, true born-again, Bible-believing Christian faiths, and they were replacing it with the one true church, quote-unquote. And this was called the Christianization of Germany. But it wasn't Christian at all. It was Catholic. It was Catholicism. Again, this man is commonly the English monk Winfrid, who changed his name to Boniface and enlarged the papal dominion. This man is commonly, but erroneously, so error, credited with the first Christianization of Germany. Invested with the authority of the Pope's legate, he traversed the countries on the east of the Rhine, rooting out the schools and churches of the evangelical faith, which had been numerously planted in that region of Europe by the Chaldean missionaries of the Irish and Scottish nations, substituting in their room Roman monasteries and cathedrals. This was the work of Boniface, a work well pleasing to Rome, inasmuch as it greatly widened the bounds of the pontifical sway. Among the events of these disastrous ages contributed to the growth of the papal power, not the least influential, were the Crusades. And so the Crusades was a Christian endeavor because, you just read it a paragraph earlier. The English monk Winfrid, is commonly called the man that Christianized Germany. But it wasn't Christian at all. And here we have this aspect of applying the Crusades to Christian. But true Christians will never take part in Crusades. Period. Let that be a lesson to the Jewish nation as well, the Jewish people, who like to keep on saying that, this teaching of Christ has caused much blood to be spilled. No. Quite the opposite. It's Catholicism that has caused much blood to be spilled. They evoked a mighty outburst of enthusiasm around the papal chair. They placed powerful kings, vast treasures, and countless soldiers at the service of the Pope. He took into his own management the estates of those who went to fight for the recovery of the Holy Land, exempting their owners from the jurisdiction of the civil power in both civil and criminal causes. Okay, so again, let me read this again. He took into his own management the estates, the states of those who went to fight for the recovery of the Holy Land, exempting their owners from the jurisdiction of the civil power in both civil and criminal causes. In other words, he got rid of them. When the fury of the Crusades had spent itself, it was found that the spirit of princes was broken. Their resources dried up, their realms impoverished by the loss of their subjects, and the only institution that had profited by the frenzy was the papacy, which now, every other interest abased, rose aloft in greater grandeur than ever. Nor was this the end of the matter. The fanatical fury which had found its first fearful discharge on the plains of Syria was diverted back to the land whence it had come, and there it vented, without exhausting itself, in those bloody persecutions and wars against heretics, which raged for centuries in Christendom. And so this is going to conclude this video and this chapter of The Papacy is the Antichrist by J.A. Wiley. And so basically what you have here is, you basically have a short, a very brief recap of, of history through the first 10 or so centuries. And, obviously, and let me read this again, nor was this the end of the matter. The fanatical fury which had found its first fearful discharge on the plains of Syria. I wonder why Syria is such an issue today. Very interesting. Was diverted back to the land whence it had come, and there it vented without exhausting itself in those bloody persecutions and wars against heretics which raged for centuries in Christendom. Okay. And this is the Christendom that was suffering greatly. Not the Christendom that is called Catholicism, because it's not Christian at all. Alright? So, that's going to be it for this edition of The Papacy is the Antichrist, a demonstration. And if you want more information, or if you want to get this book or receive this book, I will provide a link to a website you can go and check out. They got they got a lot of reliable information and a lot of reliable sources and a lot of dots that are there, and all you gotta do is connect them. It's called Grand Design Exposed. Okay, and he's got his contact information on there. You can go and contact him, and and he'll be glad to get in touch with you. And you can actually get a copy of The Papacy is the Antichrist from him. And he also throws in that little booklet other portions of other books that kind of correlate with The Papacy is the Antichrist, a demonstration. So be sure to check out that website. That link will be posted in the description box below. And until next time, truth be told, truth be known, stay safe, God bless, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.